Today, we're going to talk about a wide range of topics. We're going to talk about fertility treatment. We're going to talk about loss. We're going to talk about what it feels like to experience multiple losses, what it feels like to be a person of color who experiences multiple losses, and the expression of others in your community when you go through fertility treatment. We're going to talk about donors and people of color looking for donors and not being able to find them. We're going to talk about so many things that really are important, not just to us as fertility patients, but also in our community. We're going to talk about representation, inclusivity, everything that's important to talk about. And we're going to be talking about it with Dr. Loree Johnson, because she's been through a lot of this herself, and she's been through a lot with her patients. And so she will explain many of these things that are important for us to know. So make yourself a cup of coffee, sit down, turn on this episode, and pay attention, because I think you will really get a lot out of it. Welcome to Donor Conception Conversations. This is the one podcast created exclusively for people who are planning to use donor conception to build their families, or for people who already have donor-conceived children. My name is Lisa Schumann. I'm a therapist, an author, a researcher, and I am passionate about donor conception and helping people find a better path to parenthood. And on today's episode, we have Dr. Loree Johnson. She is a really interesting person and a social media whiz. We can see a lot of what she's doing on social media. She has a wealth of information, both personal and professional. She seems to really have her finger on the pulse of how it feels to go through fertility treatment unsuccessfully, to experience countless treatments and miscarriages and all sorts of other things. And she bravely shares it with her audience, which I really appreciate, because it's so important for people out there to not feel alone. And she does EMDR and supportive therapy and all different types of therapies. She's talented in many ways. And today she's going to share with us both her personal experience and some also professional information that will be so helpful to us. So thank you for coming. I really appreciate it, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
So can you tell our audience a little bit about your story and about what made you decide to move into this field, or did you always work in the fertility field?
I did not set out to be in reproductive health and to work in the infertility space. I think that this niche or space found me. I started off my career in community mental health. I really enjoyed working for a children's mental health agency and thought that was going to be my career. And about 6 years in, I decided to transition to private practice, which was definitely a better fit for me clinically, and just being able to kind of sprout my wings and work with more of the clientele that I wanted to work with. And what I started to notice was a shift happening in my clientele. I was working with more older women who had delayed their family building efforts because of career, and they wanted to feel kind of more established, or they found their partners later. And also what that shift kind of symbolized was also this difficulty in, getting pregnant as well. And so that was where I started to, kind of start doing the work before I even identified as a reproductive health therapist. And then I think that also mirrored my own experience, my personal experience. I met my husband later in life and wasn't really concerned about my fertility. And then shortly after we got married, I thought, okay, you know what? Maybe it's time. I'm ready. Let's try. And that's when, probably about 6 months after we got married, was when I had the first of 4 losses within 4 years. And then I went through a very harrowing journey and took some time off to regroup and reevaluate where I was clinically as well, because I felt like what was a very interesting experience for me as a therapist going through recurrent pregnancy loss, and then also a therapist who was trying to seek support for fertility or loss related issues. And even though I had a wonderful therapist at the time, this therapist wasn't necessarily as well versed on treatments as, so I saw some gaps in the field that really let me know and affirmed that once I was further along in my journey, that I would recommit or shift my clinical practice to the infertility and loss space. And so that's kind of what I've done for the past several years, and really enjoyed how I showed up. It's been very empowering for me, and sharing, a lot of the strength that I've learned, and really powerful experiences, and being able to impart that to my clients and hold space for them. And some of the most vulnerable times of their lives has been an honor, and to be on their journey with them.
Wow, that's incredible. And I saw in some of the information that you wrote
Mhm.
on your page or on your website about your losses, and that you even got to the place where you were thinking about maybe living child free. That was a
Yes.
consideration for you.
It was, because the one thing that I think is important, and when you are on the front end, as I like to say, of fertility treatments, I was still relatively naive about like success rates, and I think that was also part of how I grew up learning about reproductive health, or my reproductive journey, and thinking about it from a cultural perspective. I was taught how to not get pregnant. And also, I think another misconception or stereotype that I grew up with was that, being a Black woman, that I wasn't going to struggle with fertility issues, or, that coupled with seeing lots of older people over 40 having children, and not necessarily realizing how much more difficult that process would be. I mean, you hear about fertility declining at 35, and yet, even with that information in the background, earlier in my career, and even working with clients who were struggling, it didn't necessarily hit home that, oh, I needed to pay attention to this. So there was definitely a shift in how I worked with that coincided with my own, kind of journey. And I think the losses in particular changed a lot of who I was personally and professionally. I think that you just going through grief in a way that you never imagined. And when you think about grief in general, you think about losing a loved one at the end of the life cycle, where it's, of course, sad, undoubtedly, but at the same time, losing a baby, parents aren't supposed to bury their kids, or your kids are supposed to bury you. And
Yes.
so I think that was a huge shift in my kind of personal space, and also my professional space too.
And so did you find that there were certain types of, because I understand you do EMDR and
Hmm.
supportive psychotherapy,
Yes.
were there certain types of therapy that you felt were particularly helpful for you for your grieving?
Yes. And that is actually one of the reasons why I decided to become trained in EMDR. Ironically, I attended a workshop. The creator of EMDR, Dr. Francine Shapiro, when her model first came out over 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, and I might be dating myself even more, but that's okay.
Hmm.
It was new, and it was exciting, and it was very, I think, very cutting edge. And, but at the same time, I wasn't really sure about it until later in my career. I think I read this book, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score. And, and going through that training, and also doing some EMDR work, helped me move through some pretty traumatic elements of my grief experience.
Hmm.
And I think the way that it works is such a powerful, there's a powerful mechanism in terms of being able to metabolize or synthesize these traumatic events, and to have them not impede your ability to function and engage with life. And so in some ways it's changed my life, and changed my clients' lives. And so I was really happy to finally get trained in that, and to facilitate a sense of healing that I felt was very powerful for me. And
Hmm.
so I think the other piece that was also another element of therapy, and not that every therapist has to go through loss in order to work with someone who has experienced loss. And what was helpful for me personally was, having my own therapeutic space with a therapist who could understand pregnancy loss in that way. And, within the context of the infertility space, of being an older parent, of trying to kind of achieve and actualize this dream that I had always had, but that was just so elusive. And so I think it was a kind of a combination of, EMDR and also supportive talk therapy that was helpful for me. And also a little bit of travel therapy too, because I think what was another healing point was, just after my husband and I experiencing so much loss, and there were so many like associations in our house and our town, and our fertility clinic is literally 5 minutes down the road, and so it was really therapeutic for us to be in a different state or country to have these experiences that allowed us to connect outside of our grief experience, outside of our individual and collective grief experiences, to reconnect with each other. And that actually was another beautiful supportive element as well, and something that I try to make sure that my clients cultivate as well. Because
change your whole environment.
Yes, because it allows you to do the work. You need those moments of reprieve or restoration in order to have the energy to manage the deeper feelings.
I completely agree with that. I think that's so important. I completely agree with you. And I think not enough people appreciate that. And certainly if you're on this fertility roller coaster, it's hard to get off.
It is. Right? It is. It's a roller coaster you didn't choose to ride.
No, it's true. So I just want to wind back for a moment to something that you said earlier. You said, being a woman of color, never really thinking about how do I get pregnant when all you've ever learned is how to not get pregnant. And then B, being a professional woman and feeling like your life is moving forward, and maybe you get married later or you meet your partner later. And then C, you have this other issue where you feel like culturally, as a woman of color, you feel like this is just something that your family does, and there's no expectation that there's going to be these issues. So how do all of those things intersect? And do you feel that those things are continuing to be problems for women of color, or do you think that's changing?
I think it's both. I think that there are cultural messages, and I can, probably speak a little bit better to the cultural messages around being a Black woman or an African American woman. But I think that some of these messages kind of, do extend to the Latina and Hispanic populations, and also the Asian populations. I think that as far as Black women are concerned, there's this idea and stereotype that we're hyperfertile, and that is a message that I think has some troubling and but very real roots in our country's history of slavery, where we were used for breeding purposes, and we were experimented on, and there were lots of assumptions about our sexuality that were really born out of that time. And so I think that what that contributed to was this idea that since we were often used to breed future slaves for slave owners, and this idea that, okay, we can get pregnant easily, or, there's just the sense of hyperfertility. And that has been a message that's carried over. And I think that I remember hearing, even talking to a couple of my friends earlier on in my journey, and one of whom happened to be a nurse, and she even told me, she was like, "Loree, you're fertile," and so I was still getting that messaging, even though I had the knowledge to know, okay, what, I'm struggling. Like, no, this doesn't make sense. But in some ways, if I'm struggling with that information, with, being a professional in the field, and, trying to really integrate all of this, it's like, I can only imagine what this means for other individuals who are, who look like me, who are trying to make sense out of the cultural messaging and yet the silence that exists within our community about, infertility and pregnancy loss, and, and then trying to seek help and support. So what I have noticed, though, because this was probably about 10 years ago, all of this started to happen for me, is that with the rise of social media, which has allowed us to disseminate information, for us to feel more connected and to share, it's brought this infertility and loss community closer together. And I think
Mhm.
being able to see that, there are lots of other people of color that are struggling and they're not alone. And I think the more that people see that and see the representation, it gives others courage to talk about their struggles too.
Have you had that happen? Have you had Black women come to you and say, I'm really struggling with this. I watch your journey. I see you've struggled with it. Also feel lost. And, culturally, I feel this is really going to be an issue, or I feel confused by it, or my family doesn't understand it. What are the things that you're hearing most?
I think that Black women do seek me out specifically because they want to talk to somebody who looks like them. I think it can help create a sense of comfort and identification. And even though we know that we're not a monolith in our community, there is a way that they might not have to censor their and their feelings, and to be more present and open about it, and talking about like what it's like in their families, because nobody talks about loss or fertility,
Mm,
and potential shame that might come from that. And I think it creates a little bit of a just seeing that representation is important, and I think it just kind of cuts through just layers of just feeling like being able to connect a little bit more deeply, to someone that, again, just looks like them, and that could potentially understand their historical perspective, and hold space for it, and not have to explain it in a way that just might feel exhausting, and very akin to what it feels like for people who are going through loss and infertility, trying to explain their experience to people who don't really understand.
mm,
Because I think we've
mm.
all heard about, like just when well-meaning family and friends will have questions about like the IVF journey for some, fertility treatments, and you might hear in the community just like it's hard to talk to people who don't get it, and they just and so I think it's very similar to why individuals of color, or Black women in particular, might seek me out for support.
And you also mentioned this idea that you have this change, right? Because you have this cultural experience of feeling like this is not something that you don't talk about openly in your family, and this is something that culturally there's this expectation. But then
Mhm.
also you have this new age of working women who don't get pregnant till later, and so you're feeling, I would imagine, even more trapped because now you have this added burden of now you had this expectation. It's almost kind of like a setup. You had this expectation like it's not going to be a problem. And then all of a sudden it is. And then
Right.
it's like an extra slap to feel like I can't talk about it now.
Right. Well, and this is an extra slap, and why it's so important to, kind of honor like that this is, this is part of the reproductive story that, that people have and that they come to us with. It's like they're really processing the fact that this narrative about their lives that had been written, by them or by their culture or both, and how
Mhm.
that story is not unfolding the way that they had imagined, the way it was supposed to be scripted, and they're having to edit in the process. So I think there are multiple layers of just like you said, feeling slapped, that are just very jarring and hard to negotiate, which really captures, I think, the essence of this journey.
Yeah, it's true.
Hmm.
And then what about the women? Because of course, we talk about donor conception. What about
Hmm.
the people that you see who are now pursuing donor conception and they've
Hmm.
had all these issues that you're speaking about? They've had this expectation they're going to get pregnant. It didn't happen. They had this expectation it would work out. It didn't. They have loss and grief that they can't even process because people are not really there for them. And then all of a sudden you need a donor and you may not be able to find one.
Right. It's heartbreaking, because I think, if my memory serves me correctly, that even the data around accessing care for Black women, I think the last time I checked, that Black women in particular, when compared to their white counterparts, are going to enter into fertility treatments 2 years later. And so in
Wow.
addition to this delay in family building because of, finding a career, or excuse me, establishing one's career and or finding a partner, and then the delay in accessing care also means the potential delay in exploring other family building options besides IVF or IUI. And so there's another layer of grief that goes along with that becomes part of the story. And so part of what I do is support people in managing that grief and continuing to explore options and what those options may mean, and continuing to normalize their experience, and exploring what each option might mean, and particularly gamete or embryo donation.
And then what's next? Because we have a shortage of sperm donors in this country in general, but we have certainly a shortage of sperm donors who are Black, or egg donors who are Black. And,
Right.
I would say even Latina and Asian as well.
Mhm.
But certainly I think, in the Black community, you have this, you would probably feel, as you're saying, this apprehension anyway, and now you're kind of stuck feeling like, now my choices are limited. I finally summoned the courage to do this thing, and now my choices are limited. What is a person to do in this situation? It's got to be so difficult.
It is difficult. It is difficult, and it's part of this grieving process, and that I think that individuals or couples go through, and I think that kind of honoring just the strength and that it takes to kind of move through the fertility process, but then also just and managing disappointment after disappointment, and then to find that there's the options are out there aren't the greatest. It's definitely another obstacle to that I think we're trying to address as a field, but on one end, and at the same time it's like honoring the reality for our clients and our stakeholders, and that there's some women who are choosing to remain childless. There's some couples or individuals who are choosing gametes that are outside of their ethnic or cultural community, and that becomes another kind of interesting nuance to talk about in terms of what that's going to mean, and how does that fit into the narrative for the couple and for the family, and also for the child who is going to be growing up knowing that they don't have a biological connection, but then might not have the same cultural connection that they would have on top of that. And so I think there's some nuances that that we're having to hold space for, some powerful conversations about that. But also it continues to highlight, I think, the ways in which we as a field still have a lot of work to do, in terms of how we talk about the issues that are facing our community, and talk about it in a culturally specific way, and doing more to recruit Black donors, and doing more outreach as well. I think representation is so powerful. Like I explained earlier, it just with social media and being able to see so many other people who are struggling the way that you've struggled, it empowers people. They see themselves in the community, and that gives people strength to talk about, what they're doing. And I just really appreciate so many parents of donor conceived individuals talking about their journeys, and normalizing the donor conception process, because again, I think that becomes a touchstone, and it normalizes the conversation. So I think that there's so much that that's continuing to happen, and I'm hopeful that will continue in that way of through more awareness and conversation, that we can demystify some of the elements of the process, and also potentially address the potential shame, and that might be kind of present for potential donors, or for potential intended parents.
So you mentioned recruitment. Do you
Mhm.
think that that's the main problem, that the sperm and egg banks are not actively recruiting Black donors? Do you think that's what's causing the problem, or do you think there's some reluctance on the part of potential donors? What do you think's happening there?
I think it's a multifaceted problem. I think that on our end as professionals, I think that we can do a lot in terms of raising awareness, education, and representation. And so that's why, it's one of the reasons why even after I pivoted professionally to work more in the reproductive health space, I went back for additional training to facilitate evaluations for egg donors or sperm donors and for intended parents as well, because people kept seeking me out. And that lets me know that my presence matters. It helps people normalize. It helps normalize the process. So I think on the provider standpoint, and maybe call it marketing, but it is in a way of, just people need to see themselves. They need to see themselves in their treatment team. They need to see themselves in the literature. They need to hear us talk about them, because the way that has been perceived is that, there's already this idea that, at least in my community, that, infertility is as a white person's issue. And, if you don't hear people talking about it, then that unfortunately can reinforce that stereotype. And it's such a surprise for Black people to hear that Black women in particular are 52 times more likely to suffer from infertility and, be half as likely to actually seek treatment. So the opposite can be true. So there's a lot that we can do around education that can, that can change the narrative. And also, I think the other piece that factors into this is just a general mistrust of the medical system, which I think culturally makes sense. And we have to honor that the medical system has not been kind to the Black community. And when you think about even how, IVF was created, and if people don't know the story of Henrietta Lacks, I really would encourage people to look her up. But because of her cells and how her cells grew, this is a woman, an African-American woman from Baltimore, who had a very interesting case of cervical cancer, and the doctors found that her cells, I'm not doing justice and I don't want to butcher what they discovered, but the reality is that, they took her cells and they were able to use those cells and because of how they replicated or whatever they did medically. And part of that was used to part of the process of creating IVF. But it was all done without her consent. And there have been multiple instances in our medical history of medical tests being carried out on our communities without consent. And so there still is this mistrust. And then when you have providers that don't look like you and might not appreciate some of the cultural differences and how medical issues might show up, it leads to misdiagnosis. It can lead to just some distances in communication that make diagnosis even, I think, more difficult, and people can feel, misjudged, and that further kind of alienates people from getting help that they need. So again, that's kind of on our end as providers to help bridge the gap. And if we're giving a lot of lip service to, being culturally informed and providing services to diverse populations, we need to make sure that our actions are congruent with that as well in our training. And I think that can also go a long way with, again, reinstilling or rebuilding trust and the community being able to access that a little bit more. And then, and I think on, just what that also does in terms of just, as being a touchstone in the community, it helps the community feel, less judged and, less fearful. And I feel like that's something from a more personal advocacy kind of standpoint that I think it's another reason just kind of speaking up can be helpful and healing and addressing some of the connection between these issues.
Yeah. And I would imagine also this, issue of unfairness probably comes up a lot too, right? I mean, you're kind of going through all of these obstacles in treatment, and you probably feeling, as many people feel, and I've heard many people say that they feel that this is, such an unfair process. And then, here you are having to choose a donor who may not look like you, right, or have the same cultural background, or maybe you find one or two and you feel kind of cornered. Do I choose them, or do I choose someone who doesn't have my background? And then all of a sudden the child may not look like me, or do I decide to be child free, or, how am I going to make this decision? And it's really kind of unfair again, all over again.
Yes. Another level of, of injustice that is associated with infertility and loss. It's part of the story, and it's our job to kind of help people lean into that. It isn't fair, and allow that, that your experience of that unfairness to be what it's going to be so that you can allow yourself space to figure out what makes sense for you moving forward. And is
Yeah.
the desire to continue to build your family still there? And, or is this part of a decision of closing that chapter?
And I think another piece, which we started to talk about a little bit before, that is so difficult is that I think that when people talk about openness, and we talk about it a lot
Hmm.
here
Hmm.
about open relationships, open
Hmm.
donation,
Hmm.
and yes, that's an ideal circumstance, but I think it's very easy when we know that it's an ideal circumstance to be very cavalier about it and say, well, you absolutely have to choose an open donor. But
Hmm.
if you are a person of color and you want your child to look like your family, or even if you just say, I want my grandfather to have a grandchild with the same cultural background, whatever it is that's
Hmm.
motivating you, I think you're entitled to make the choice that you want to make. And
Hmm.
unfortunately, you may not be able to have a donor who's open, right?
Right.
And that's the way it is. And so I feel badly because I think so many people feel that pressure. Well, you must, without question, choose an open donor or don't bother moving forward
Hmm.
with treatment. And that's a tough position for people to be in because they may have no choice.
They may have no choice. And I feel like the messaging around open or known donors versus unknown donors is shifting. And I'm glad to see that shifting too, because in this age of DNA testing, and that's how I think a lot of people are starting to a lot of older people are discovering that they're donor conceived as they're taking these
Hmm.
23andMe or ancestry tests and learning that they don't, they're not who they thought they were. And so
Hmm.
I'm glad to see and hope that conversation can change as we even do those evaluations to begin with, to set up the expectation around a sense of openness, because I think there's laws are kind of changing around that, because the most important thing that donor conceived people are aside from, I think the most important information that they are wanting to know is just their medical history, and having that information, it makes sense. It's definitely a shift. It's a shift. And I think historically it made, we thought we were making the best decision at the time and recommending closed donations, and not necessarily thinking about attachment or medical history or anything that donor conceived individuals might be important to them. But as we're getting and hearing more of their voices, I think that's shifting. And that's also something that I try to help my clients or potential intended parents understand and kind of wrestle with as they're making their decision too. It's not just black or white, there are just so many, I think, different things that people have to kind of weigh, prioritize.
Yes, and people have to think about a lot of that. And of course, there's no such thing as anonymity. But if you only have one or two donors to choose from,
Hmm.
there's not a lot of decision to
Right.
make. And
Hmm.
so I think it's a really difficult place that we're in
Yeah.
history where openness, fortunately, is become more prominent. But at the same time,
Hmm.
if you choose a donor who ethnically or racially or culturally is going to be similar to you, and that's a priority for you, you may have very few choices,
Right.
unfortunately.
Yes. Yeah.
So yes, unfortunately, that's an issue. But
Hmm.
so just kind of back to the donor, do you feel like you feel like if the clinics and the banks were actively recruiting more donors of color, more Black donors specifically, as we were talking about, you feel like that would be very helpful?
I think so. I think so.
Hmm.
I think part of being representing, and servicing a diverse population is really making sure that you're connecting to the diverse population and making sure that your staff, your approach, again, represents that. And I think outreach is a part of that. And because I'm always very aware of when I go into a doctor's office, the racial makeup of the doctor's office. Do I see
Hmm.
magazines that reflect me or my family? Are there people of color on staff? And if they're not, I pay attention to that. So that's why representation is so important, because I know that historically that I'm going to be treated differently. And I think that if there isn't necessarily a sense of diversity, or I'm more likely to, to kind of have an adverse, kind of medical experience. And sadly, that kind of comes from some of the data that is connected to maternal health, and that says we're more likely to have successful births and pregnancy outcomes when we're cared for providers that look like us. And so it's like,
Really?
what is yeah so that's something that that we can pay attention to, and or need
Yes.
to pay attention to.
That's so important. Well, I hope
Hmm.
everyone who's involved in the medical community who's listening to this takes heed, because I think that's really important. And we've kind of learned that lesson, certainly in the queer community and in so
Hmm.
many other communities. And so we have to just keep that going
Hmm.
and remember that, diversity is diversity. And we
Hmm.
need to make sure that everyone, really thinks about that also.
Hmm.
All these issues, I'm really glad that you're bringing them, to the light, Loree, because this information needs to be out there constantly for people to see and for people to understand, because, we need to keep moving forward. As you're saying, this is a really difficult time for a
Hmm.
lot of people, and a really painful time. And particularly when you are in a situation where there's so many challenges, it's really helpful to make sure that at least you have providers who understand you and you have
Right.
representation and you feel comfortable where you are. And as you're saying, your quality of care may actually be better. I think those
Yeah.
are really important points. Thank you so much for sharing them.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So before we wind down, is there anything else you feel like we missed or that we should be talking about that the audience might want to know?
I appreciate all that you do to, for the donor conceived community. And so I'm just honored to be part of the conversation and trying to, help advance the conversation, and, creating space for all voices. I'm still learning, but I'm still honored to be a part of this. And I think I also want to if there are older donor conceived people, I know that there are lots of groups out there and advocacy groups that have an invested interest in what we do as professionals. And I appreciate their lived experience and how they've shared that. And they've given us a lot of insights about what to do and what not to do in particular. And I just want to kind of start to place the bug in everyone's ear, because I have a colleague that is doing a research project on individuals who've had positive experiences from the donor, from being a donor conceived person. And so I think that's going to give us some more wonderful information that we've known anecdotally about what's been helpful, but can kind of build on some of those positive experiences. And so I think that, I'm just grateful. It's a long-winded way of saying, it can be daunting at first, and not to say that it's not difficult. And family building through donor conception is still a beautiful thing. And so I think there's just a lot that we can do through this, these channels of building awareness and normalizing this, so that we can support all of those who need it.
That's great. Well, I think that's a wonderful way to wrap up tonight. And thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. And is there some place that people can reach out to if they have more questions on social media or your website?
Absolutely. You can email me at Dr. Loree, DRLOREE, at drloreejohnson.com, or Instagram at Dr. Loree Johnson.
Great. And for all of you out there, thank you so much for listening tonight. This was a really important conversation for us to have, and hopefully we'll be able to have more like this. And if you like this episode, please let me know. You can press like, you can subscribe, you can write a positive comment. I'd always love to hear what you have to say. And certainly you can reach out to me at familybuilding.net anytime. I really loved your attention and having you with us and joining us in our little community here. And come back for our next time, because we have lots more to share.
It's fun to start when they're little, or start reading them stories, start talking to them about their story, because by the time they can talk back to you about it, you're going to be really good and comfortable at talking about it. And it's literally so much fun.